CSE 3200 Yukon stores. We are in Chapter 16 on implicit intents, and here in video 4 we finally get to implicit intents. No code in this video, just talking about the 4 parts of an implicit intent. On the screen you see 3. We'll need a couple more slides to describe all the different parts. Part 1 of an implicit intent is the action you intend to perform. This basically is a constant such as action view or action send. The second part is the location of the data. It could be a URL of a web page, but it could also be a URI to a file or a content URI pointing to a content provider. We get into content provider in Chapter 17, but before I move on, I'd like to point out the difference between a URL and URI. URL is something I'm sure you're very familiar with. It is highly regulated, and it is describing the places on the web. So URL of a web page is a location. A web page is a location on the web, the internet. A URI, and URL, by the way, stands for Universal Resource Location. URI stands for Universal Resource Identifier. I think this might help a little bit. If I make a Venn diagram of URI and URL, a URL is just a subset of a URI. Highly regulated URL, not so much URI. URL is always specifying a location. URI can be specifying a name, a location, or both. The third part of an implicit intent is the data type, something like text, HTML, audio, MPEG-3. And if an intent includes a location for the data, then the type usually can be inferred from the data. So I'll show you an example, and we'll look for all the different parts. And in the example that I showed towards the end of the video, you're not going to find the data type because the location is going to make it so that we can infer that. Let me erase this. The fourth and final part of an implicit intent is optional. If an action is used to describe what to do, the category usually describes where, when, and how you're going to try to use an activity. There's a couple examples up here in this paragraph. If we're going to use android.intent.category.launcher, it's going to indicate that the activity should be used at the top level app launcher. And if we have android.intent.category.info, then that's just indicating that the package is going to describe some information but not be included in the launcher. Here is another example, and this one is going to lead us to our more specific example on the next slide or two. So suppose that we want to make a web page. We are going to have an implicit intent for viewing the website, and it's going to include intent.actionView, and the data URI is that URL of the website. Before I get to that specific example, based on this information, the information you saw on the last 2 slides, the 4 different parts, the action, the location, the data type, and the optional, then we will be able to launch the appropriate activity of an appropriate application. The implicit intent needs to be declared within the manifest. It needs to advertise itself out to the universe, whatever is going to be querying our app to see if we can do a certain job. Okay, so this is an example of us building a website, and we're going to look for the 4 different parts. So our action is view, and our location is here in the 3rd line. This didn't need to be hyperlinked. It shouldn't be hyperlinked, but I did not take that out. www.bignerdranch.com as an example. The 3rd part is the data type, and I pointed out in a previous slide that that's not here because it can be inferred by the location. The 4th part is optional, and we have a couple of things to take a look at here. To respond to an implicit intent, an activity must have Android:exported set to true. So this particular intent is basically on the receiving end, and it needs to be able to respond to an intent. So We also, as part of that, need to set the intent filter to the default category. That line here, which is optional, and these two lines are saying that we are going to be able to respond to an implicit intent. This one here serves another purpose, this default constant. It's going to say that if we are pulled to do a certain activity, in this case view, something that we are advertising we can do, then we are going to volunteer to do that. We will see this later on in our videos for Chapter 16 as we have options that we are going to broadcast out. Something a little bit different than building a web page, and specifically in our case, we are going to ask for something, and we are going to find that we have a couple of choices that we can have. We're going to broadcast out, hey, I want to do this certain thing, and it's going to ask for volunteers. Now those different applications that we are broadcasting our request out to will be able to say, okay, you're asking for this, I can do that, and I will broadcast that I will volunteer to be the app that you use in order to perform that task. Okay, so that is video 4, which happens to be the 4 parts of implicit intent. I will see you later in Chapter 5, where we begin to send a crime report.